Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to talk about better bounds for block cipher modes of operation via nonce-based key derivation, and this is joint work with Shai Geron. The problem that we're trying to address is the huge volume of data that's now being encrypted in many different applications, and this problem is only going to get worse as time goes on. And as I'll explain in a few minutes, block cipher modes of operation all suffer from limitations on the amount of data that we can encrypt due to birthday collisions. So we like to think of encryption schemes as secure or insecure, but actually they're almost all of them are secure only up to a certain amount of data, as I'll show in a moment. And this was actually utilized recently in the Suite 32 attack on TLS on triple DES, because triple DES only has a 64-bit block. The collisions happen very fast, and this was utilized actually to retrieve data from encrypted cookies. So what's in Countermode encryption? We have some nonce. We concatenate that with a counter. That's input into the block cipher. The output of that is pseudorandom. We use that to mask the encryption. So we have this pseudorandom permutation, which is the block cipher that we used in the Countermode. And the security of the encryption scheme is based on the assumption that this behaves like a random function, because we're using the output of the block cipher to mask the plain text. And as long as there's a unique nonce or a unique input into the block cipher every time, then the output should look random, and then we have this masking and everyone's happy. The problem is that there's a very big difference between the first and two bullet points in the slide. The first one talks about a random permutation, and the second one talks about a random function. And the difference between a random permutation and a random function is exactly the birthday paradox. So for a 128-bit block, we expect a collision at 2 to the 64 blocks. Typically, we recommend that errors should happen only with probability 2 to the minus 32. At least this is what NIST recommends in Countermode, GCM, and so on and so forth. And that means that by the birthday paradox, you can encrypt up to 2 to the 48 blocks before you start having this distinction between the random function behavior and the pseudorandom permutation behavior. So that gives you a limitation on 2 to the 48 blocks in Countermode, even when all the nonces are unique. It gets worse, though, because standard Countermode uses a 96-bit nonce. We have the nonce, and we concatenate that with a 32-bit counter. And that means that when you're choosing this nonce at random, after 2 to the 32 encryptions, you expect a collision of nonce with probability 2 to the minus 32. Again, birthday collision. And that means that if you encrypt more than that and you have nonces colliding, then it's a complete disaster, because what you end up getting is two encryptions that you can easily see are using the same nonce, because that's visible. And you can XOR the ciphertext and get an XOR of the plaintext, which has been shown to yield the original plaintext with very high probability when it's, for example, English text. So we have a limitation here, which is even more severe on at most 2 to the 32 encryptions. AES GCM, which is an authenticated encryption mode, so it gives us also integrity guarantees, is based also in Countermode and therefore has exactly the same limitations. You can encrypt up to 2 to the 32 messages with a random nonce and no more. And here, actually, if nonces collide, the situation is much, much worse. Because in Countermode, if nonces collide, we get a local failure where you get the plaintext of those two messages. In GCM, if the nonces collide, not only do you get those plaintexts, the authenticator is also broken forever. So that means you can now forge messages, tamper with messages, if you ever have a nonce collision. So you have to be very, very careful in something like GCM to make sure that you don't have any nonce collisions. The question you may be asking is, okay, this is all very nice, but these numbers actually seem quite high. Do we really need better bounds? If we're using triple DES, then for sure, because with a 64-bit block, we get failures very, very early. But why use triple DES? We can just move across to AES, and if we're already proposing some change to something that's being deployed, then make a bigger change and just use AES, and the problem goes away. And if we're using AES, we have now a 128-bit block. 2 to the 32 encryption sounds like a lot. Maybe it's enough. And if it isn't, can't we just guarantee unique nonces? Then we have this 2 to the 48 bound on the number of blocks, which sounds huge. So firstly, with the amount of data that's being generated and used, 2 to the 48 blocks is 256 terabytes. It sounds like a huge amount, but it's actually not such a huge amount. And in the coming years, we're going to see these volumes of data on a daily basis. So for a number of applications, we are going to need to be able to also deal with much, much larger volumes than we ever imagined or until a few years ago. But here's another maybe possibly more compelling example. QUIC is a protocol that's been proposed and is being used by Google to reduce latency of connections. And it prevents DDoS attacks by using source address tokens, which are issued to clients. And this proves that you've actually connected in the past, and so you're not spoofing a connection. And the way this works is that you have a large cluster of servers, and client can connect to any server and later on connect to another one. So all these servers have to be using the same key to generate these tokens. And because they're independent servers, it also means that you can't have any sort of synchronization between them. So it means you have to choose a random nonce. You can't guarantee unique nonce. That would require synchronization between these servers. Now, if you use AES-GCM, which is what they were using, you can only encrypt 2 to the 32 messages. Now, even if you are willing to rotate keys on a daily basis, which from an operational point of view is not great, it's feasible, but it's not great, you would still only be able to issue 50,000 tokens a second. And in large organizations like Google, but not even that large, but in large organizations, then you need to be thinking about the capability of issuing hundreds of millions of tokens per second, especially when you're under a DDoS attack. So therefore, you need the capability of encrypting much more with a random IV, and that's something which you don't have for any of the current modes of encryption that are being used. When we come to design a block cipher mode of operation, there are 3 things that we typically need to take into account. 1 is efficiency. Obviously, we want it to be very fast. 2, what level of security that we need. Is it just basic chosen plaintext security, or authenticated encryption, or even nonce misuse resistance, which means that even if a nonce repeats, nothing bad happens, it's okay. And finally, what security bounds are that we get. So it's not true that all modes of operations are created equal. It depends, how much the volume that we can encrypt depends very much on the bound, and that's something we want to maximize as well. So in this paper, we propose a solution to getting better bounds, and our solution actually works for many different types of modes of operation and can also for each type of security category that I mentioned a moment ago, and we demonstrate that in the paper. And the idea is that key rotation is a good solution because the problem that we're addressing is encrypting too much data with a single key, but it requires the coordination and is a very big pain. You have to store previous versions of keys. You don't want to re-encrypt everything, so you have to know what version you're using, and it's something that we really don't like to do. So if we're going to rotate a key once a year, that's fine, but definitely not something that we want to do on a frequent basis. So our proposal is something which may sound a bit strange to start in the beginning, but let's rotate the key at every single message, but not rotate in an arbitrary way that requires storing information. We'll derive a new key from the nonce in every single encryption. So when we want to encrypt, the first thing that we do is apply some key derivation function using our key to the nonce, and then we use that derived key to encrypt the message with the nonce just as we would beforehand. Because that's the only change we're proposing. One very big advantage of this is that we require very minimal change to the encryption scheme, to the existing mode of operation. In fact, you're just doing something beforehand, and then you continue using the same code as afterwards. This is always a very big advantage. We want to try to make the changes as minimal as possible. The intuition here, why this is a good idea, is because now we have different keys per message, so we can encrypt many more blocks. In particular, we don't have this limitation of 2 to the 48 blocks anymore because we're going to be using different keys and we can encrypt much more. This direction, though, raises 2 main questions. The first question is what key derivation method should be used? We could use a hash function, but that's going to be very slow. We could use standard block cipher-based key derivation like AES and Countermode, but that also is vulnerable to birthday collisions, so that won't give us the bounds that we're looking for. And even if we overcome the collision problem, we need to run a key schedule now for every single encryption. And key schedule is actually much slower than encryption itself. In particular, in the AES-NI instruction set, Intel highly optimized all of the round functions, but didn't optimize the key schedule, and for very good reason. Typically, you run a key schedule once, you store the key, and you can encrypt a lot of data with it. So there wasn't any necessity to fully pipeline and optimize this instruction. So key schedule can be very slow, and that's a problem. The second question that we ask is, okay, so this intuitively gives better bounds, but what are actually those concrete bounds, and are they good enough, and are they very significant? Because we are making a change, and there is some performance penalty, so we want to see that we're doing something which makes a big enough difference. So coming first, addressing the key derivation, our aim is to to use a block cipher. We don't want to use a hash function, but we want to not have a birthday bound problem. So the fact that the block cipher is a permutation, not a random function, is something that we want to solve. And what we do is we use a truncated block cipher. What does that mean? It means that you apply AES, and instead of taking the entire block, you only take some of the block. You maybe take half of the block as the output. And Gilbert and Goron actually showed that this method gives very good bounds. Intuitively, if you're only taking half the block, now you will have collisions, unlike before, and it's not a permutation anymore. And so this behaves more like a random function than the full output of the block. And they showed a tight bound of the minimum between q squared over 2 to the n, which is the standard birthday collision. And the second term is q over square root of 2 to the n plus n, where m is the amount you truncate and n is the block size. That looks a bit hard to swallow, so let's just look at concrete numbers. If we take a 128-bit block, like in AES, and we truncate it to 64 bits, so we throw away half the block, then the advantage is q over 2 to the 96 for q derivations. So now that means you can actually derive 2 to the 64 different keys with advantage of only 2 to the minus 32. So this is much, much more than you would get beforehand, because previously, if you just did direct counter mode at 2 to the 64, your probability of failure of distinguishing is a half. And now it's still 2 to the minus 32, so it's safe to derive up to 2 to the 64 different keys, which is our advantage, which is our aim. I just want to note this is not the only method. You can also, for example, use an XOR of different PRPs. There are other methods as well, but this method is definitely good enough for what we want, because we're not, it's hard to conceive of deriving more than 2 to the 64 keys. Anyway, if you wanted to, you could truncate even more, because the bounds get better the more you truncate. But this now sounds like maybe it harms efficiency, because if I want to derive a 128-bit AES key, I need to apply AES twice. If I want a 256-bit AES key, instead of using 2 AESs, I use 4 AESs. But with AES-NI, which is almost everywhere today, this is completely meaningless, because it's a fully pipelined instruction. In fact, doing 2 AESs or 4 AESs is a difference of a few cycles only. So actually the performance penalty is almost zero in terms of 2 versus 4, but there is still the problem of the key schedule. In order to compute this, we need to run a key schedule at every single encryption, and the key schedule, as we mentioned beforehand, is expensive. So how do we bypass that? And our solution is to use the pipeline key schedule method that we actually presented here 2 years ago in the context of garbling and secure MPC. We use that same method here, and I'll explain that briefly right now. The AES key schedule is mainly, most of the cost is through running the subbytes operation, which is an SBox lookup on every single byte. That's the main cost of the AES key schedule. An AES encryption round has that subbytes as well, but it also has a shift rows operation, a mixed column operation, and add round key operation. That's in all of the rounds except for the last round. In AES, the AES's last round, there is no mixed columns operation. So you have subbytes, shift rows, and add round key. And what we want to do is we want to do the key schedule using the round encryption instruction of AES. The reason we want to do that is because Intel did optimize that instruction and made it fully pipelined and very, very efficient. So that's what we want to use. Now, add round key is just XORing the key in. So if we run this operation with a 0 key, then effectively that operation goes away. And we're left with subbytes and shift rows. but we can use another fully pipelined instruction, which is called pshuffb, to undo the work of the shift rows in the last in the AES round instruction. So it sounds a bit strange. We have this instruction which does three things, and we neutralize two of them in order to only get one. But because Intel highly optimized this instruction and not the key schedule instruction, this turns out to be much, much more efficient, and it can be fully pipelined, and not only fully pipelined with itself, it can be pipelined even with encryptions of the first blocks while we compute. So let's look concretely at the efficiency. So the numbers here might look a bit small to you all, so you can take out your binoculars. But for a 128-bit key, if we want to generate 256 bytes of 256 bits, of key, then the cost for generating a 128-bit key, the cost for key expansion using the AES key schedule is 111 cycles, and with our method is 48 cycles. And when you pipeline that together with encryptions, even doing 4 encryptions costs 76 cycles. So the cost of a key schedule plus 4 encryptions is only 76 cycles versus just key expansion by itself using the AES key schedule, which is 111 cycles. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that the actual cost in encryption is very, very low. When it's 1,000 bytes and above, it's between 1% and 7%, depending on the size and the exact mode you're using. For shorter messages, there is a penalty, but in AES GCM, for example, it's 34% on a 64-byte message. This is such a fast mode of encryption in any case that that penalty is something that is reasonable if you need large volumes. So it's not that there is no penalty, but the penalty is very small, and if you're encrypting larger amounts of messages, which is typically the case, then it's almost unrecognizable. What about the security bound? So now we've said we can do the key scheduling efficiently, but how much do we actually gain by this method? So in order to prove this, we look at a multi-instance experiment for AES, and we ask if you have n different block ciphers, and we want to compare that to n different random functions, and we have an assumption about how AES performs, which is a standard AES assumption on how AES performs in such a multi-instance case. And then we prove that our key derivation function and our key derivation method for deriving a new key per nonce gives an advantage which is the sum of 3 advantages. The first advantage is the advantage that the adversary has when running n key derivations, because we need that for n different nonces. That's the first. The second is the advantage of the adversary in the multi-instance experiment that we mentioned here, because we do n key derivations, and now we run our encryption with n different block cipher instantiations. We have a different key each time. And in this multi-instance experiment, we now want to transfer the analysis from a random permutation to a random function. So each derivation yields a different block cipher, and we want to make that indistinguishable from random function. And then finally, we analyze the original mode of encryption, but instead of using a block cipher, using a truly random function. And then it's the sum of these 3 elements, and that's the bounds that you get. The nice thing about this is that the first 2 are actually fixed analyses and independent of the mode of encryption. So we've already done that work. We've done the analysis in the paper. And if you want to apply this to a new scheme, then it's easy to work with, because all you actually have to do is analyze the mode of operation with a truly random function. And that's much, much easier to analyze and to get very, very good bounds for. And you just take the first 2 terms from our analysis, the third term for the new scheme, and you can use our method and everything plugs in very easily. But what bounds do we get? So we analyzed our scheme, our method for 3 different schemes. One, Countermode for chosen plaintext security, AES GCM for authenticated encryption, and AES GCM Cipher for nonce misuse resistance. And we looked at 2 settings for each. What happens when we're in a nonce-based setting? And then you can talk about nonce respecting adversaries. So for authenticated encryption and chosen plaintext security, we assume that nonces never repeat. And for nonce misuse, we allow the adversary to also repeat the use of nonces. And we also look at the random nonce setting, where we assume the nonce is chosen at random, and then we know what the bound on repetition is by the birthday bound. So let's look at Countermode. So in Countermode, we're assuming unique nonces, because if the nonces are not unique, then anyway, security fails. And the original Countermode advantage is b squared divided by 2 to the n plus 1, where b is the number of blocks being encrypted. This is the 2 to the 48 that we talked about beforehand, if you want security 2 to the minus 32. And that's because at the birthday bound, you have this distinguishing capability between a random permutation and a random function. With our Countermode with key derivation using our method, then the bound changes to n times b max squared divided by 2 to the n. So what does this mean? N is the number of different encryptions, number of different messages being encrypted. And b max is the maximum number of blocks in any single encryption. Okay, so we move from b squared to this n times b max squared. And concretely, let's consider 2 to the 48 encryptions of length 2 to the 16 each. With basic Countermode, this is broken with probability 1/2, because we have 2 to the 64 blocks being encrypted overall, and that's all with the same key, so you're broken with the birthday bound exactly. But with our method, you actually have an advantage of just 2 to the minus 46, so we're still very, very secure. And in fact, we can even encrypt 2 to the 64 plaintexts of length 2 to the 16 each, and still have an advantage of only 2 to the minus 32. This is way, way beyond the birthday bound. So we're talking about an almost imaginary number of 2 to the 80 blocks being encrypted and still having 2 to the minus 32 security. This shows that we actually get very, very impressive bounds and a strong increase in security using our key derivation method. What about with a random nonce? So here things are a little bit more subtle. If a nonce collides, then you're dead in both cases. Okay, you're dead with original Countermode, but you're also dead with what we're doing, because we're deriving a key from the nonce. So in both cases, you're deriving the same key, and then you're encrypting both messages with the same nonce, so you actually haven't gained anything at all, and the streams will collide and security will be lost. Okay, so if you have a nonce of length L, then you can't encrypt more than n squared over 2 to the L. In fact, you have to do less. So you have the 2 to the 32 bound that we had beforehand, but we can still encrypt much, much longer messages. So Countermode has this b squared over 2 to the n plus 1, and we have this n b max squared over 2 to the n. So what about encrypting 2 to the 32 messages, each of length 2 to the 32? These are now very long messages. Basic Countermode is broken with probability 1/2, because again, you're at 2 to the 64 blocks. But our method still has an advantage of at most 2 to the minus 32. So with a random nonce, you can still encrypt much longer messages, and you're gaining in that sense with our method. As I mentioned beforehand, we carried out a similar analysis for ASGCM and GCM Civ. ASGCM is very similar to what I showed you in the previous slide, because it's essentially Countermode with this additional authenticator, and that additional authenticator behaves very nicely irrespective of what we're doing. And ASGCM Civ is nonce misuse resistant, which means that even if nonces repeat, you're still safe. To be a bit more exact, if you have the same nonce used with 2 different messages, then that's 100%. If you have the same, obviously the same message with 2 different nonces, you're also fine. The only thing that's revealed is if you use the same nonce and the same message twice, then the attacker can see that you've encrypted the same thing twice. That's inherent because it's a deterministic function once you include the nonce as input. But apart from that, everything is fully safe. So the only thing you can do is detect repetition. So that's a very good thing. And these are the bounds that we actually get for ASGCM Civ. I hope you can see these numbers. If you want to encrypt 2 to the 45 different nonces, and each nonce can repeat 1,000 times. So we're talking 2 to the 55 encryptions, okay? But each nonce repeats 2 to the 10 times, and you're encrypting messages of length 2 to the 16 blocks, you still have 2 to the minus 45 advantage at most for the adversary. So this is also beyond the birthday bound, and you still have very high security. You can even encrypt 2 to the 48 different nonces with 2 to the 10 repetition and 2 to the 14 message length. That gives you 2 to the 62 blocks overall, and still 2 to the minus 33 advantage. One thing which is important to note is that If you reuse nonces at a very, very high rate, then this does affect the bound. It affects the bound because you're no longer using different keys each time. So the advantages that you get from nonce-based key derivation degrade the more you reuse a key. So if you encrypting 2 to the 48 messages, so 2 to the 48 different nonces, messages of 2 to the 16, then you actually get 2 to the minus 29, which is no longer good enough. For random nonces, though, which comes back to our original motivation for quick, we get something very, very impressive, because here you actually can bound the amount of repetition by the birthday bound, and because it's nonce misuse resistant, we don't mind if it repeats a little bit, and it won't repeat too much because the nonces are random. So with 2 to the 64 encryptions of messages of length 2 to the 12, you have 2 to the minus 35 advantage. So that's encrypting 2 to the 76 blocks, and you still have 2 to the minus 35 advantage. Or you could look at 2 to the 48 nonces, or 2 to the 48 messages with random nonces and a message length of 2 to the 20. Here you're at 2 to the 68 blocks, and you have a bound of still 2 to the minus 35. So this, for all applications in sight of, for many, many years to come, these are very, very strong bounds, and this will be able to deal with large volumes, many, many different encryptions by independent machines that are not able to synchronize with each other. So in summary, continual nonce-based key derivation is actually provides very good bounds. It's not expensive to compute, and it requires only minor code changes. That's really the best of all worlds. We provide general analysis of the technique and specific analyses of Countermode, GCM, and GCM Civ, and show that the bounds that we get are very, very strong. And overall, the cost of key derivation is very small, and the bounds that we get are a significant boost, and show that it's worthwhile paying that small price. Thank you very much. So I have to look at the exact bounds. I think that, from what I understand, if XORing 2 different PRPs actually gives you better bounds. But where our aim was getting to 2 to the 64, and we're not looking beyond 2 to the 64 key derivations, and that's why we chose this method. But each one has a slight difference in terms of the implementation cost. Yeah, you need 2 keys. Right. No, we don't have 2 keys. If you truncate using the 1 key. If you take 2 different block ciphers and XOR, then you need 2 different keys. You're using Countermode and taking half, yeah.
I also have a question regarding the truncation. So that's only used in key derivation, right?
It's only during key derivation, yeah.
Okay, so and the bound that you showed is like a minimum of 2 quantities, right? So where essentially the second quantity is like a square root of the first quantity. Well, I mean, so,
yeah.
So does that affect the concrete security?
No, well, it's the minimum of the 2. So the q squared over 2 to the n plus 1 may be even better for a very small q. But it's for large q, in that case anyway, everything is very small. For large q, the second term is better, and it's the minimum of those 2. So the birthday bound will actually end up being the larger element.
So if that second term gets improved to, without the square root, so essentially, will that improve the concrete security? So what I mean is, like, that term, how important is that term?
That term it's important in the key derivation. That's okay. What determines the advantage in the key derivation. So if it tells us we can derive 2 to the 64 different keys. If you use something which didn't allow you that much, then you wouldn't be able to encrypt with 2 to the 64 different nonces. If you use something which is, that's a tight bound, yeah. No. Yeah, that's a tight bound. Gilbo and Goran have shown that okay. Bound is tight.
Last quick question. So there's all this line of work on like building AE schemes with beyond birthday bound, from scratch. So can you just comment on comparisons with those types of constructions?
So I think Shai maybe can answer this better than me, but from my understanding, our aim is to be able to take existing schemes with existing code where optimizations already exist, like GCM, for example. That's also what we showed on the line of counter in GCM, and to be able to get all those existing performances and get improvements. With other authenticated encryption schemes, you can get, for example, better bounds by truncating Countermode, in general Countermode. You should be able to use our scheme to get even better than that. So if you use the focus of this paper is using nonce-based key derivation. If you take other schemes, existing schemes that already are beyond birthday at a certain bound, you may be able to use this to get even better. You would have to test that out. Of course, it's not the only way to get beyond birthday bounds. There are many other ways as well. We're not saying that.